Hello, I'm Alec Avdakov, and welcome to the life and times of Frederick the Great. I want to jump into this topic as soon as possible, but first I want to apologize for my abysmal upload schedule. I started an online class so that I could teach full-time history rather than substitute teaching. Thank you all for your patience, and if you're on Patreon, I am deeply sorry for the wait. As you can tell by the title, this is a summarized version of the overall events of the War of the Austrian Succession. Because this is the story of the war as a whole, Frederick will not be the leading role, although his actions will tell a huge part of the story. The main focus of this story is the rivalry between Great Britain and France. This era of history can sometimes be titled the Second Hundred Years' War because the British and French were off and on in war with each other from 1689 until 1815. Yes, there were decades when there was no war between the two powers, but the same can be said of the Hundred Years' War. This war, therefore, became a global struggle because the two sides had empires that speckled the globe. In the War of Austrian Succession, there was fighting in Europe, North America, and Asia. But how did this war get started? That I can tell you in one word: mushrooms. Charles VI, the Holy Roman Emperor, the head of the Habsburg family, died because he had food poisoning from bad mushrooms. He had no sons to inherit the throne. His daughter, Maria Theresa, would inherit the Habsburg lands. However, Frederick II of Prussia, aka your boy Frederick the Great, thought he could coerce Maria Theresa into giving Silesia at first with diplomacy and then by force when he invaded the province on December 16, 1740. The fact that a second-ranked power like Frederick's Prussia thought it could take the Habsburgs' richest province and get away with it made many in Europe consider Frederick a crazy dude. The Prussian army did occupy the whole province during that winter of 1740 through 1741, however. But the Austrians under Field Marshal Neipperg raised an army to take back Silesia. The Prussian and Austrian armies met at Mollwitz on April 10, 1741. While the Prussian right-wing cavalry broke and Frederick fled the field, the Prussian infantry stood firm and advanced on the Austrians like moving walls and won the battle. This victory was a turning point that one could argue caused this regional war to become a global war. Much like the Battle of Saratoga would 37 years later, this battle brought the French into the fold. Austria's allies, Britain and Russia, were distracted by wars of their own and could not aid Austria if France were to involve themselves in this war. So, France, along with her German allies, Bavaria and Saxony, like sharks smelling blood in the water, attacked. However, Frederick did not want the Austrians to disintegrate and negotiated a ceasefire at Klein Schnellendorf on October 9, 1741. Despite the ceasefire, the French and Bavarians advanced into Austria and took Prague, while Frederick and the Prussians invaded Moravia. The war then expanded in another way. Spain also wanted to enter the war to gain some territory at Habsburg expense in Italy. The Spanish had over 20,000 troops in Italy by January 1742. This was the moment for the Habsburg Empire to go for broke. The Austrians sent an army from Vienna to counterattack the mainly Bavarian troops occupying Austria. And it was a massive success. While Charles Albert of Bavaria was being crowned Holy Roman Emperor on January 24th, 1742, his capital Munich was being occupied by the Prussians. The tide turned further in the Austrian favor when Sardinia-Piedmont signed an alliance on February 1st, 1742, to fight the invading Spanish. The British, who was at war with Spain since 1739, had a fleet in the Mediterranean that was now reinforced and looked poised to attack the Spanish supply ships. Spanish diplomatic bungling also played a role in the balance of power in Italy. Spain had an army in southern France waiting to cross into Italy, but it was blocked by Sardinia-Piedmont and Genoa. Lack of reinforcement, a preemptive Austro-Sardinian campaign against Modena, and a whole lot of desertion caused Spain to withdraw from their invasion of Austrian Lombardy. While that was all going on, the Austrians had more success in Bohemia and cut the French off in Prague. But, as we saw in the episode Fritz at Chotusitz, Frederick once again pulled a rabbit out of his hat and won a victory at the Battle of Chotusitz. Go back to episode 27 if you want more details on that Prussian victory. That victory took Prussia out of the war against Austria while keeping Silesia in the Treaty of Berlin. The Saxons also left the war against the Austrians in the autumn of 1742. While losing Silesia was painful for the Austrians, it now had troops freed up to fight against the French in central Germany and the Spanish in Italy. While this gave Maria Theresa more breathing space, it set the precedent that Habsburg lands could now be taken. The last half of 1742 was marked by maneuvering in Italy and Bohemia. By the end of the year, the Austrians had retaken Prague, and the Spanish had occupied Bologna and Savoy, a territory held by Sardinia-Piedmont. No major battles took place during the rest of 1742, and it looked as if the balance of power slightly favored the British Habsburg alliance. But know when I say there were no major battles, this does not mean there was no fighting. People fought, died, pillaged, and raided throughout the areas the armies occupied. The new year of 1743 began with the death of Cardinal Fleury, the dude who led the French foreign policy. Louis XV would take over his own foreign policy. This part of French history had the so-called King's Secret, where Louis XV had his openly declared ministers and a group of secret ministers who would often spy on the other ministers. Wheels within wheels. While France was internally in chaos, the Spanish looked to pick up the slack in Italy. Spain wanted to strengthen its alliance with Spain by attacking into northern Italy. The Spanish commander crossed the river Panaro to take Modena on February 3, 1743. Count Traun, the Austrian commander, opposed the 13,000-strong Spanish army with an Austro-Sardinian force of 11,000 men. Despite expectations and a strong Spanish cavalry attack, the weaker Austro-Sardinian army held and pushed the Spanish army back. The Battle of Campo Santo was an Allied victory that was extremely bloody for the amount of soldiers present. A quarter of all soldiers present would either be killed, wounded, captured, or lost because of this small battle. This battle also did two things. It allowed the Austrians to advance against the Spaniards, and it strengthened French commitment in Italy to bail Spain out. 1743 spelled more doom to the allies of France, Spain, and Bavaria. The Austrians advanced rapidly into Bavaria in the spring and signed an armistice with the Bavarian army on June 27, 1743, that essentially neutralized their 12,000-strong army. The Austrians could now focus on attacking France directly. Britain also had an alliance with the Netherlands, or, to put it bluntly, bribed the Dutch into fighting. They formed the, quote, pragmatic army and defeated the French army at the Battle of Dettingen. Look back at episode 40, Destruction at Dettingen, for more details about that. To bring the British-backed alliance into an organized form, the allies of Austria, Britain, and Sardinia-Piedmont signed the Treaty of Worms. This held the allies closer together and also gave Sardinia-Piedmont more land once the war had ended. If that didn't look bad enough for the French, the Russians concluded a peace with the Swedish with their new Empress Elizabeth on August 1743. The Swedes were long-standing allies of the French and had been tying down the Russians in a war since 1741. But for every action, there is an equal opposite reaction. The French strengthened their commitments with Spain and raised 30,000 men to fight in Italy. They also pivoted their war efforts against Britain rather than Austria. They invited the Stuart Prince Charles to start a revolt in Britain to take back the throne from the Hanoverians. France also heavily reinforced its troops to attack the Austrian Netherlands, which is today Belgium. The French rightly assessed that Britain was a larger threat than Austria. Without British money propping up the Austrians, Sardinians, and Dutch, the alliance would splinter like a tree stuck in a tornado. After Dettingen, there were no major battles for the rest of 1743. The British-backed allies did not exploit their tactical victory into something bigger. But there was small-scale fighting, and the armies maneuvered along the continent. In February 1744, the Franco-Spanish and British navies fought a sea battle in the Mediterranean just off the coast of Toulon. This was a very, quote, disjointed battle according to Reed Browning's overview of the War of Austrian Succession. Keep in mind, I am in no way an expert on naval warfare, let alone in the age of sail. But in the 1700s, the standard way of fighting a naval battle was to put your ships in a line and fight parallel to your enemy. At Toulon, only half the battle lines of each side fought against the other. The Spanish section of the line fought the front section of the British line, while the French and the rear of the British line were not heavily involved, if at all. Fun fact, the overall commander of the combined French and Spanish fleet was 78 years old at that battle and would outlive Maurice de Saxe. The result of this battle was surprisingly pretty murky. Reed Browning describes the battle as a British victory because it split the Spanish off from the French, while if you look on Wikipedia, the internet's most reliable source, it declares Toulon as a Franco-Spanish victory. I would call it a tactical win for the Spanish because they took out a fair amount of British ships, but a strategic win for the British because it forced the French to call off their plan to transport troops to Italy overseas. While the French focused their war policy against Britain, the Austrians had something up their sleeves. On December 1743, the Austrians signed an alliance with Saxony, which caused them to switch sides. Meanwhile, France tried to persuade the Prussians to rejoin the fight against Austria. While all this was happening behind the scenes, some fighting was happening on center stage. 20,000 Austrians faced off against 20,000 troops from Spain and Naples near Rome in a town called Velletri. The Italians had a cunning plan to capture the King of Naples, who was in the Allied camp. But the king found out what was going on and left, supposedly, only half-dressed on a horse. While the Austrians took fewer casualties, 1,500 compared to the Allied 3,500 men, the Austrians frittered away their chance to take Naples either by advancing into Naples with their army or by capturing the King of Naples. The Austrian army now just sat and waited. In northern Italy, however, Spain and France coordinated an advance on Sardinia-Piedmont. In a brilliant campaign in the Alps, the allied French and Spanish armies divided their forces among multiple prongs and overwhelmed the Piedmontese mountain outposts. This culminated in taking the fortress of De Monte on August 17, 1744, 2 weeks after the Battle of Velletri. In short, things were looking up for the Spanish and French in Italy. The other big event in 1744 was the Prussians re-entering the war against Austria. I have a whole episode dedicated to that, so listen to episode 42, Frederick Strikes Again. In short, 1744 did not end well for the Prussians. But let's head back to northern Italy, where the French and Spanish armies looked like they would triumphantly march into the plains of Piedmont. However, King Charles Emmanuel III of Piedmont was a cunning fox, and he forced the Allied army back despite losing a battle against the French and Spanish army. He basically unleashed guerrilla warfare, held a fortress that was the key to reaching the plains, and fought a battle, all to buy time for the weather to turn on the invaders. Charles Emmanuel of Piedmont lost the battle against the French and Spanish, but because of the successful resupply mission to the fortress and the guerrilla warfare, the Spanish and French were forced to retreat before the end of the year. Now, 1745 was a huge year for the War of Austrian Succession. It started with the death of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VII on January 20th, 1745. This meant that France no longer had an excuse to help keep the integrity of the Holy Roman Empire because Charles's son, Maximilian, was not trying to get that stinking crown. Later that year, Bavaria and Austria made peace. Maria Theresa's husband would later be elected the Holy Roman Emperor. A Habsburg would be back on the throne. In the spring, France had made some moves that would culminate in the Battle of Fontenoy. I have an interview episode with that battle in the background, so check out episode 43 with Dr. Jonathan Abel about Maurice de Saxe. In short, the French won the battle and started the long process of conquering what is today Belgium. If we jump over to Central Europe, where Frederick is fighting, the Prussians fought the Austrians in two major battles at Hohenfriedberg and Sohr. You can check the story of those two battles out in episodes 43 and 44. But in short, Frederick won those battles by the skin of his teeth and fought the Austrians to exhaustion. The Saxons got involved on the Austrian side, but they were quickly knocked out of the fight. The Austrians and the Prussians made peace on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1745. There was now a tenuous peace in Central Europe. On the other side of the world, the British and French were fighting in North America. On May 10th, 1745, a force of about 4,000 New Englanders and 100 transport vessels began their invasion of what is now Newfoundland, then known as Cape Breton Island. The island was dominated by a fortress known as Louisbourg. The invading force surrounded and captured the fort in little over a month. The French commander surrendered Louisbourg on June 28, 1745. 1745 was also the beginning of the Jacobite uprising against the British crown. I have two episodes about that, 47 and 49. These are great overviews of an insane situation. To summarize, Britain's old royal family was trying to retake the throne with French help. The French really just wanted to distract Britain from Flanders and didn't expect much success. Speaking of uprisings and revolutions, in the island of Corsica in the Mediterranean, there was an incredibly long fight for the independence of the Corsicans. The Republic of Genoa had ruled over Corsica but had little control since the Renaissance. When they raised taxes on the Corsicans in 1729, Corsica burst into flames in a civil war that would basically go on until the French took over the island in 1769. This was that time period's version of the civil war in Yemen today. Just northeast of Corsica in northern Italy, the front was heating up. Instead of the Franco-Spanish allies having multiple dispersed thrusts in the mountains as they did the year before, they split their armies in two and took a southern Alp path into the plains. The French and the Spanish had 80,000 men that acted like a battering ram to smash into the North Italian plain. The French and Spanish conquered Parma and split the Piedmontese army away from the Austrians. At Bassignana, on September 27, 1745, the Franco-Spanish army defeated Piedmont in a one-sided battle where numbers were the deciding factor. The French, with the 18th century idea not to disturb the balance of power too much, did not want to press their advantage against Piedmont or Austrian Lombardy. So, the Spanish moved on their own and captured Milan from the Austrians on December 16, 1745. The Austrians saw their situation and chose not to fight so they could keep their army intact. By the end of the year, the French and Spanish armies had occupied most of northern Italy, but trouble loomed over the horizon. The two armies were separated by a river, and supply lines were very extended. If the Austrians could get their crap together, a concentrated attack against one army could overturn the Bourbon advance. In most histories, the War of Austrian Succession after Christmas Day 1745 is usually glossed over because the war between Austria and Prussia is over. Historians go, "Welp, if the war basically ends in a treaty that just says keep the map like it was before the war, except Prussia takes Silesia, we'll just skip it." But you know me, the most entertaining bits of history are the super random details, so I'm just going to swim upstream and focus on the last 3 years of the war without Prussia. After Prussia left, the main front of the war was in the Austrian Netherlands, where Maurice de Saxe commanded the French army. The Duke of Cumberland commanded the allied British, Dutch, and Austrian army. The secondary front was in Italy, where the talented Prince of Liechtenstein commanded the Austrian army, and this Walloon dude was fighting for Spain. Count Gage was the overall commander of the Franco-Spanish-Italian army. First, we'll look at the war in the Austrian Netherlands, then in Italy. After Fontenoy, Maurice de Saxe had conquered multiple Belgian fortresses, including at Ghent. Maurice, the sly fox, pulled off a major coup against the capital, Brussels. Maurice faked reports about his womanizing, cockfights, and even a stroke to convince the Austro-British allies his army was staying in Flanders. But in late January, he led a force of over 20,000 men to surround Brussels. It then surrendered on February 22, 1746. We now move from one cunning man, Maurice, to another, King Charles Emmanuel of Piedmont, Sardinia. The charming Charles exploited division between France and Spain to stall for time. With Austria no longer at war with Prussia, it could move their troops into Italy. The Spanish and French troops were divided, and the Austrians could overthrow the Bourbons in Italy. Piedmont negotiated a ceasefire with France for 2 months to buy some time for the Austrian army to arrive. Then, on March 5, 1746, the Piedmontese army attacked a major French garrison. By March 11th, Charles Emmanuel took back the lost territory from France. Much of the blame for this incompetence of French diplomacy, in my view at least, is down to Marquis d'Argenson. He convinced himself that Sardinia-Piedmont was only a signature away from peace, and that no plot was being cooked up behind his back. Instead, Piedmont-Sardinia pulled a well-timed maneuver to turn the tide of the war in Italy. On top of that, the Austrians took back Milan from the Spanish on March 20th. The whole Bourbon position in Italy was crumbling like a graham cracker. Meanwhile, Maurice de Saxe was methodically conquering more of the Austrian Netherlands. Antwerp fell on June 3rd, and the French army in Flanders numbered up to 100,000 men. But 6 years of war began to show its signs of exhaustion among all powers. Britain, while maintaining the largest navy in the world, had been at war with Spain since 1739 and fought France since 1743. It had no major standing army and could do nothing decisive on the continent. France was losing many men, and its finances were in ruins. Picture a walnut with an empty center. While the outer shell of the regime was hard and its military was gaining glory, its inner system was hollow and extremely corrupt. Austria, which began the war fighting for its very existence, had regained its place as a respected great power with Maria Theresa's husband as Holy Roman Emperor. But it had lost many men and was in deep debt. Spain was just iffy when it came to war making and simply wanted a member of the Spanish royal family to gain a principality in Italy. Piedmont Sardinia wanted an enhanced and secure place between France and Austria and was losing men they could not afford to lose. The Netherlands hardly wanted to join the war in the first place and still had not declared war on France. While all powers looked for peace at the beginning of 1746, none found a deal that would work for everyone, so they just kept fighting. To completely oversimplify the fighting in Italy in 1746, the Austrians fought a battle against the French and Spanish at Piacenza, and the Austrians won. This led to the disintegration of the Franco-Spanish army and a Bourbon exit from Italy. The Austrians even captured the French border town of Nice on October 17, 1746. By the end of November 1746, the Allied armies of Piedmont and Austria had jointly occupied all of northern Italy, including the city of Genoa. But let's move on to what is today Belgium to see what Maurice de Saxe has been up to since he captured Antwerp. 3 major fortresses fell from July to October 1746. At first Mons fell, then Charleroi, and even the powerful fortress of Namur fell to French arms on October 1st. Maurice had maneuvered his huge main army with the skill of a ballet dancer, all while avoiding battle. That is, until the serial blunderer Charles of Lorraine advanced too close and too recklessly. Maurice sensed an opportunity to destroy the Allied army along the Meuse River next to Liège. At the Battle of Raucoux, Maurice attacked the Allied army but could not pull off a decisive victory. France still won, but it was not quite the outcome it needed. This battle would end the campaigning season in the Austrian Netherlands. While one front began cooling down, the Italian front burst into flames of revolution. Genoa was a republic pebble in a sea of absolutist monarchies. At the beginning of the war, the nobility of Genoa was split between neutrality and joining the war alongside France and Spain. The war faction won, and Genoa joined the war in 1744. However, that bit them firmly in the butt when the Austrians and Piedmontese began to occupy their small republic in 1746. Genoa was also split between the very rich and very poor. Therefore, when the Austrians began to occupy the city, refugees from the countryside began crowding the city, and the nobility began taxing the poor to pay for the Austrian extortion money. All it took was a single spark for Genoa to explode. That spark turned out to be an Austrian cannon that got stuck in a ditch. When a commander tried to force some Genoese citizens to get the cannon unstuck, the soldiers were met with a volley of cobblestones. That small group began to quickly grow into a large riotous mob that eventually threw out the Austrians from the city in 4 days in December of 1746. The revolutionaries abused the Austrians left behind, arrested collaborators, and even set up a rival government to the traditional Genoese government. Mirroring a future revolution that opposed British interests, the French would support Genoa in February 1747 with guns, money, and soldiers they could smuggle in to Genoa. With the Austrian army overextended and now surrounding the French port of Antibes, the French under Marshal Belle-Isle began a counteroffensive on January 21st, 1747. This reversed the gains of the Austrians and pushed them back into Italy. This, however, left France with a problem that Genoa was still very isolated. The land route was blocked by the Austrians and the sea route was blocked by the British. Nevertheless, 3,000 troops, 200,000 livres, and a French duke to command them were smuggled into the surrounded city. The French commander boldly promised, quote, "Show me the danger, and I will seek my glory protecting you from it." Despite the city being completely surrounded by the Austrians on land and the British at sea, Genoa managed to hold on, even into June of 1747. From one revolution to another, in the Netherlands, the middle and lower classes wanted more participation in the Republic and more centralization. The system of government was controlled by the very rich and was extremely decentralized. In the spring of 1747, the Dutch began to revolt in favor of Prince William IV of Orange to become the executive leader to fight back against the French. By May 10th, 1747, Prince William IV was elected stadtholder, or the equivalent of president, of all the provinces in the Netherlands. Despite the dramatic events, the military situation had not truly changed. Maurice de Saxe still outnumbered the Austrian, British, and Dutch allies and looked to take over the rest of the Austrian Netherlands and the southern province of the Netherlands. Maurice de Saxe knew that he outnumbered his enemies and that all sides were severely exhausted after 7 long years of war. So his goal in 1747 was to avoid a battle that was not of his choosing. If he could occupy more territory without losing a single man to enemy fire, he would succeed. However, Louis XV intervened and told Maurice of the goal to capture the treacherous fortress of Maastricht. To do this, Maurice would need to win a battle against the allies of Britain, Austria, and the Netherlands. The two opposing armies were huge. The French numbered roughly 125,000, and the Allied forces about 100,000. 250,000 men met outside Maastricht on June 2nd, 1747. The objective for Maurice was to destroy the army in front of him, so he planned to wedge and split the British from the Dutch wing on an attack near the small settlement of Lafeld. Despite the assumptions of Maurice, the British fought tooth and nail to hold their positions, and the whole battle became a meat grinder along the line. Numbers soon began to tell, and the Allies had to retreat later that night. The French had about 10,000 casualties compared to 5,000 Allied losses. This was very much a Pyrrhic victory for the French, and Maastricht would not be conquered this year. While the slow tide of the French army was creeping ever forward, the fighting in Italy began to bog down into a stalemate. On June 3rd, 1747, the French and Spanish under French command began a two-pronged attack into Italy. One went south along the coast, and the other would be a mad dash straight for the capital of Turin. But Louis XV intervened once again to mess things up. I'll let read Browning's quote that describes the French king do the talking. Browning wrote, quote, "Displaying the sovereign disregard for sound advice and common sense that marked him as a royal fool, Louis XV once again interposed his judgment in the strategic deliberations of the Franco-Spanish army. In short, Louis made the Spanish general the commander of the army, despite having, as Louis himself admitted, worse plans. But on July 14th, 1747, the French resumed their advance into the Alps against the mountain fortress of Exilles. To oppose this, Charles Emmanuel, the cunning man he was, set up a major obstacle for the French to get through. There were massive piles of rock, 18-foot tall wooden stakes, and a perfect high ground for the Piedmontese to find cover and shoot at the French. Imagine the Italian front in World War I, but on a mini scale. On July 19th, the French were to attack this porcupine of a position with 25,000 men against 15,000 Piedmontese. 4 times the French tried to climb this impenetrable defense, and 4 times they were beaten back with horrifying losses. Men would climb on top of their comrades' corpses to try to reach the peak only to be shot. The French lost horribly in this battle. They lost over 5,000 casualties, including 4,000 men dead. The Austrians and Piedmontese lost only around 300 or so men, mainly being wounded. This terrifying battle closed the Italian front. Both sides had lost many men over the last 4 years, and northern Italy was devastated. There would be minor raids and skirmishes in Italy until the treaty was signed, but for all intents and purposes, that was the game right there. But let's also not forget this war was a global conflict. There was small-scale fighting around the world, not only on Europe. Back in September of 1746, the French fought the British in India. The French captured the British East India Company's base at Madras. However, the French were losing the war at sea to the British overall. Therefore, the French tried to set sail from their Atlantic coast to reinforce their North American and Indian imperial territories. But the British were waiting and smashed the French fleet on May 14, 1747. The British captured almost the entire French fleet sailing that day. However, many of the transport ships managed to slip through. It was another major naval battle that, on October 25, 1747, broke the back of the French Navy. Despite the French having huge ships that outgunned the smaller British ships, 6 French ships were captured in that battle. Afterwards, the supply ships that were originally sailing with the French warships were nearly all captured by the British. A British admiral at the time said that the British, quote, had more French ships than now remained in the ports of France. Britannia truly ruled the waves by the end of 1747. Coming into 1748, all sides were about as exhausted as a runner on the 22nd mile of a marathon. However, it was clear to all who the 2 main powers were in the war, France and Britain. Britain could do nothing against the slow methodical march of Maurice de Saxe in the Low Countries, and France could do nothing against the dominance of the Royal Navy. Diplomats, therefore, from France and Britain realized that if they could find a common ground between themselves, the rest of their allies would have to follow. While every power had their own ambitions and strengths in the negotiations, the British controlled the pocketbook of its allies, and France had the strongest army and did the most fighting and dying on its side. There was also a ticking time bomb for the French that could tip the scale in the Low Countries. Austria and Russia signed an alliance in 1747. The Russians were sending roughly 30,000 men all the way across Europe to fight against the French. The French negotiators were attempting to find a peace before those men could tip the scale. However, Maurice de Saxe had one last rabbit he wanted to pull out of his hat. The plan to capture the daunting fortress of Maastricht was incredibly clever for a time when communications were awful and timing meant everything. Maurice sent most of his siege equipment west to make it look as if he would attack along the Dutch coast. He sent his second-in-command a portion of his army to march back into France and then make a mad dash northeast to Maastricht. This whole time, Maurice was wining and dining in Paris to make it look like nothing was going to happen. Then, on April 15th, Maastricht was surrounded. The mighty fortress would fall on May 11th, 1748. This was the capstone of the glorious career of Maurice de Saxe. I'll be honest, before I began the podcast, I had never heard of Maurice de Saxe. But now I see him as one of the best strategic commanders of the day. He was not a man like Frederick who relied on tactics to win strategic victories. He was a man who would win the campaign even if he lost the battle. Maurice would be the last great commander in the French army till some Corsican guy ran the country, I don't know. With the final major action of the war, let's talk about what the terms of the peace would be. In the colonial arena, all territories would be returned to their pre-war owner, and France would withdraw from the Austrian Netherlands. There was one exception to this idea of status quo: Italy. Don Philippe, a member of the Spanish royal family, would receive a duchy in Parma. This was taken from some Habsburg possessions in Italy. The peace guaranteed the pragmatic sanction, or the idea that Habsburg lands could no longer be divided. It guaranteed Charles Emmanuel's position in Italy, and it also guaranteed Frederick's conquest of Silesia. France would also firmly recognize George II as the King of Great Britain and would no longer support the Jacobites. The preliminary treaty was signed in the now German city of Aachen on June 15, 1748. There would be a ceasefire after 3 months. This was for practical reasons because people in India or North America wouldn't find out about the treaty until months after it had been signed. Quoting Reed Browning's book, quote, "The war had lasted 2,865 days when the young King of Prussia launched a snatch-and-run operation for the province of Silesia. Consider the consequences if that invasion had failed at the Battle of Mollwitz. While not the largest battle of the war, it was, in my view, the most important battle. This battle transformed the war from a regional German squabble to a global war when France and Britain became involved. While there were no major territorial changes, the psychology of the leaders and diplomats of the European courts had shifted. They were willing to risk more in a war to stick it to their enemy. France and Austria had nearly bankrupted themselves to gain a small advantage over the other. The seed of a diplomatic reversal seemed to be planted as well. Prussia was finding more common ground with Britain than France. Austria did not seem as large a threat to France. We will see if this seed will gain any fruit. However, in the long and short of it, many ordinary people died in this war of lofty ambitions. Mothers, fathers, sons, sisters, children, babies, all of them, who had nothing to do with the war and simply wanted to survive, had their lives cut short because of this brutal war. We will never truly know the actual scale of deaths in the War of Austrian Succession, but we can estimate, and it is terrifying. Roughly 100,000 combatants died, and around 400,000 civilians died in this war. That means around 500,000 people died in a war before the invention of the machine gun. It's impossible to visualize this scale, but I will try. 500,000 people would be like if the largest stadium in the US, the University of Michigan's Big House had a sold-out game for 5 nights, and everyone inside were killed. 500,000 people is more losses than the US had in all of World War II. In short, a horrible tragedy for humanity. I have and always will use this platform in the promotion of humanity. Talking about this is a reminder that wars started because of foolish ambition are never worth it. I want to thank you all for listening after this awful uploading schedule. I love sharing this to you all, and I think I just needed to rediscover that love. In the words of a megalomaniacal general, I shall return.